Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris, and the title of today's session is Horses, Fish, and Why They Matter in English Language Teaching, Facilitating Learner Autonomy in the Age of Generative Artificial Intelligence. So, as you can see, I've divided this masterclass into 4 sections. We'll start by looking at this bigger topic of what actually do we mean by independent learning in English language teaching. I'll then look at the flipped classroom and what we can learn from that phenomenon in terms of encouraging both independent learning and a teacher growth mindset in terms of shifting the focus of the classroom. And then finally, in section 3, we're going to be looking at the way in which the ecological AI ecosystem can itself encourage both the learner and the teacher to think about ways in which AI can be used in a principled way in order to make learner autonomy and personalized learning as efficient, effective, and yes, of course, fun as possible. And then towards the end, we'll draw our conclusions. So let's dive in and let's start by looking at this whole question of what actually do we mean by independent learning? Well, you've heard me talking about fish and horses, and let's go to that point straight away. So here we have a picture, and I'd like to ask you this question. In the context of learner autonomy, can you guess the phrase, the idiom? I'll give you a hint here. We don't have much evidence, but it could well be that Confucius said this. I'll pause for a few seconds, have a think, type answers in chat if you like, but can you find that link between fishing and learner independence? Okay, so that's the fish. Let's move on. And here's our second picture, this time a horse. Have a look carefully at the image and what are the 2 elements that you can see in particular? Again, I'll give you a help here. You can ignore the bird. It's everything else that matters. And again, this leads us to thinking about some of the challenges we face when we're encouraging our students to be autonomous learners. Can you think of the idiom? And I'll pause for a few seconds. Again, you can put your answers in chat or just have a think. Does anything come to mind? All right, reveal time. So, Confucius apparently once said, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. And this, I think, is incredibly important. We want our learner, our fish-eating person, to be independent. So rather than forever waiting to be given that fish, and if the fish doesn't materialize, the person goes hungry, if we teach a person to fish or we teach a person to learn a language, then they are freed of us as the teacher. They can carry on when we're no longer around. Now, in a language school context, where students might be studying 15, 23 hours a week, nevertheless, how many more hours do they spend outside of the classroom? And how richer would their language learning be if that can become a time for language study and enjoyment as well? But of course, as always, it's not enough just to give people the tools, as crucial as that is. Because yes, we can take that language learner to the source of language, much as we take the horse to the source of water. But it's the learner, like the horse, who has to actually do the learning, or in the horse's case, do the drinking. So, how can we encourage the learner who has the skills to actually drink up and enjoy the English language? That's what we're looking at today. both through the optic of artificial intelligence, AI, but also more traditional contexts as well. So I think it's important to start off by just actually thinking about what do we mean by learner autonomy, the student who is independent of the teacher. One of the big definitions goes back to Holleck in 1981, writing the ability to take charge of one's own learning. In other words, there is agency, there is responsibility, there is control over what, when, and how we learn when we are away from the classroom. Now, this is as valuable for the student who is in some way engaged with learning through an institution, a student at school, a student at university, a student at night school, a student in a private language school, as it is for the person who is studying a language entirely independently, not attending lessons. We want both those groups to have a degree of independence. But why? Well, if you get a group of 15 students in a language classroom, the chances are there's going to be about 15 different reasons and 15 different motivations for learning. No language course can meet the specific needs of every individual within it. So by taking charge of our own learning, what we're enabling the student to do is to have charge, to have responsibility, so that they can meet their individual needs by and for themselves. Even more important when there isn't necessarily a teacher there to guide them. All of which, of course, presupposes one thing: the ability to have good learning strategies. And this reinforces the value of good learner training. So all of these ideas, not in bold on screen, by the way, come from the Autonomy section of Thornberry's 2017 A New A to Z of ELT. So let's look a little bit more about this. So if for learner autonomy to really take place, I think the learner has to have certain skills in place, and they're listed here on screen, as well as some ramifications, some responses to this. First of all, the learner needs to be able to manage their own time. But they're going to need resources as well. And as soon as we start talking about resources, we do have challenges because resources are not equal all around the world. There are issues of digital equity in the global south as well as the global north. And that is both in terms of access to technology, but also access to the skills to learn how to use that technology well. Likewise, it's important that the student is equipped with appropriate learning strategies, both for what they want to learn, but also how and where they're learning. There needs to be within the learner, likewise, a sense of resourcefulness, but also criticality. This comes from the work from two researchers, both of whom writing recently in the English Language Teaching Journal. You can see the reference in the list that's available separately and at the end of this session, whereby with AI, there is a tendency, particularly among young people, to take as 100% truthful what we see on screen. But of course, many of us know that we can't trust everything we read, and therefore we need to develop this sense of criticality if students are going to use AI in a sensible and efficient way. All of these require training, all of these require development, because without them, then any attempt at learner autonomy is going to be at best imperfect and possibly completely inappropriate and not sustainable. So you might be thinking, well, I've seen horses, I've seen fish. Why am I now looking at a cake? Well, the reason that we're looking at the cake is that the cake stands as the finished product of this, a set of ingredients. And I think in terms of considering what are the ingredients for good learner training and therefore at the end point, good learner autonomy, we need to look at one of the core ingredients, and that is learner motivation. Because if the learner is not motivated, she is not going to be able to sustain independent learning. They'll get disinterested, bored, they'll give up. So let's spend a while thinking about motivation. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the extrinsic, intrinsic motivation side of things. But if you're not, or just as a helpful brief summary, as the word suggests, X, this is something that is external. It comes from outside of us. So, for example, the student who says, I need to improve my English because I need it for work and I'll get a promotion. There they have external motivation. Likewise, if your parents are paying for private classes, and as a child you think, you know what, I really need to show my parents that I'm grateful for the investment they're making in me. Both of these are factors which may well motivate us from externally, from outside, to pay attention to learning English. So it's really about what the external environment, and therefore to a large extent what the teacher and the school brings to the learning environment. But if that's extrinsic motivation, what do we mean by intrinsic? That's on this next slide. Intrinsic motivation, as the first three letters suggest, internal, coming from inside, is really that internal force from within us that makes us want to do something. Now, personally, I never really enjoyed studying science at school. I had no intrinsic motivation. I didn't have a passion. I didn't have a love for it. And that probably explains why I wasn't very good at it and I gave it up as soon as I could. But I did have a passion for learning languages. And that's what drove me forward. And I started becoming a little bit successful, and then more so. So I learned French, and then I learned Italian, and now I'm learning Welsh. Plus, of course, learning how to be a teacher. So I had strong intrinsic motivation. And there was this love of personal development around language learning that kept me going. Now, in an ideal world, we will have a combination of both the extrinsic and the intrinsic. As a skillful teacher, what we can aim to do is build on a student's extrinsic motivation, those things around them. Maybe they see English as being a passport to a successful career. The ability to go to university and study in an English language, English medium instruction environment. But as we encourage them on that journey, motivated externally, we might be able to set alight something within them. And that is going to be really valuable because deep down, it is the intrinsic more than the extrinsic motivation that we need in order to encourage students to do the hard work of learning a language. Now, there isn't time today to go into detail about the ways in which, as teachers, we can encourage motivation. So, what I encourage you to do, if you are watching this session live, and thank you for joining us, is to come back to the recording and look at this slide on encouraging motivation in a bit more detail. We have here on the left some of the characteristics of teachers who successfully motivate their learners, who can maintain the extrinsic or maybe even help to develop the intrinsic motivation of the learner. On the right, we have some of the things that happen in terms of the teacher's role, the teacher's activities that help to make learning motivating. The first one, taking care when planning lessons and particularly focusing on interaction patterns, where students are using English to communicate together, not just filling in the gaps. Because the students who want to be able to use English, it's that moment when they are talking to one another that they are more likely to be motivated than when they are simply filling in a gap with a missing word. So I hope what I've been able to do in this short explanation of some of the key points on this slide is just to touch on the importance of motivation in keeping students focused on their goal. Because when they're focused on that outcome, then they begin to value the importance of learner autonomy, that independence as a learner. So, what is learner independence? What does it look like? Well, on the one hand, you've got the learner who can neither do anything for themselves and doesn't know how to do anything for themselves. They don't have the skills. That is the student who is entirely dependent on the teacher for their language learning success. And I think we can probably recognize they're not likely to go very far. On the other hand, we have the fully independent learner, the student who has all of the strategies and the right strategies in place to be successful, and then is using them in order to make the most of their free time to improve their English. This doesn't mean that they're sitting in front of a book studying all the time. It might be that they're going to the cinema and they're watching films in English. They're listening to their favorite music in English. They're gaming in English. But whilst they're having fun, they're also using English and indirectly, implicitly learning from it as a result. But of course, let's face it, most of our students are going to be somewhere in the middle. And that's where the importance of guided independence comes in. And that's where our role as teachers really begins, because we are the guides. We are the people who are facilitating that student's independence. Now, if you're working in a language teaching environment where it's all about assessment and exams, you might be tempted to think that our job is to get the students through the test. I disagree. I think our job is to help the students to become lifelong learners. And it's interesting that the British Council accreditation scheme, which looks after private language schools and private institutions in the UK, where English is taught as an international or as a foreign language, they actually have quite a lot to say about independent learning. This comes from a document that was published earlier this year. And when they look at the availability of resources, which comes in the P for premises section of the inspection, the British Council say that it is important that students should have access to resources or independent learning that's relevant to their aims and their expectations. In other words, we as providers in the UK are measured on how we enable our students not just to learn in the classroom, but what we're doing to help them to learn outside as well. Usefully, the British Council provides a list of examples of what they consider to be good practice, some or all of which you'll find in good language teaching centres. They might have some online virtual learning environment or a physical self-access centre. They provide a range of information to enable students, guiding and motivating them. There might even be a member of staff who is available in a particular room at a particular time to give students guidance in their self-access, in accessing learning materials in their own time. Tutorials, library use, using the internet wisely. Not just having a self-access centre, but ensuring that it is open and it's available at the times when students want it, maybe lunchtime or after school, but also an online learning platform, which is available to students so that they can dip in and out of their learning and their self-study, not just whilst they're in class, but when they're on the bus coming to and from school and so on. But the British Council, in fact, goes further as well. It also considers some of the integration of helping students to become more independent in the way in which it measures the teaching in those schools. So courses should include study and learning strategies that support learning whilst the students are at the school, but also after they've left. And also that students get help in identifying what their needs are. So I want to use English because I want to be a brain surgeon. What kind of English do I need? Someone's available to guide them on perhaps options around medical English, and also to receive support in order that they can meet those aims. Now, it's likely that you don't work in a British Council accredited school, but I think that these guidelines that we've just seen do help us to understand that independent learning is something that doesn't happen automatically. It's something that we teachers need to encourage. And chances are you're doing it already. So let's have a look at some of the more traditional ways in which learner independence was encouraged by teachers. So, for example, most of us set homework. Question is the homework we're setting necessarily the right homework to encourage the student to enjoy English rather than think it's boring? Can we encourage students to undertake some independent research using the coursebooks that they're using? So, for example, if there is a grammar point that is coming up the night before, can we ask the students to read something in advance from their coursebook and then come in the next day and work in small groups to create an infographic demonstrating what they've studied in their own time? We can ask students to interview people. We can ask them to do quizzes by looking for information on the internet. All of these are relatively low tech, relatively frequently experienced ways in which teachers are mediating learner independence. They're setting the student up to do things in their own time. And I would call this, if you like, teacher mediated independence. The students being guided in what they should do. It might be if they're doing some research around a grammar area, they're not just using their coursebook. They're told, here's a list of websites you might want to visit, or they're given free choice, including AI. But it's the teacher who is mediating this. The teacher has some degree of control over the process. But of course, what we're finding more and more, particularly with AI, is that there are ways in which we can give students more say in what they do, greater learner agency. So we may have some kind of system in which we encourage our students to be involved in extensive reading or extensive listening. What I mean by that is reading for pleasure or listening to watching videos, listening to music in their own time. We may not even tell the students what they should be reading. It's their free choice. But the students then come back at a certain time every couple of weeks in class time, and they share with their peers what they've learned, what they've read, why they enjoyed it, why they recommend it, and so on. So the process of sharing can encourage one learner to try something new, but the fact that it kind of provides the student with a degree of an accountability. If they do this, they're getting praise from their teacher, that can be motivating, but more importantly is the check-in of what they're doing. And if a student is enjoying it, they're likely to really get a buzz from sharing that with their peers. Apps, of course, are really changing the way in which we are working with learning. More and more students are learning languages through apps. I'm learning Welsh through Duolingo. But we will see more and more of students using also AI. And that's something I'll turn to in the later part of the session. So I think we can see there is a bit of a shift taking place. Up here, we've got a very traditional classroom. The teacher is in control. The students are all doing the same work. Whereas down here, we're in a different learning environment, one which I think more and more of our students demand, they expect, and that we provide, where the students are using technology to find things out for themselves, and where they're much more free in terms of what they study, when they study, and how they study. They're not chained to the classroom and their desk anymore. And this made me think of the significant shift that took place when the flipped classroom became a thing about 20 years ago now. So let's have a look at the flipped classroom and how and what we can learn from it in terms of encouraging learner autonomy or taking students on that journey towards it. Well, in this traditional classroom model, we have the all-knowing teacher passing on knowledge to the students who then practice it in their copybooks, the so-called phenomenon of knowledge transmission and knowledge banking. The problem with that is that students don't tend to be very excited by it. Many students will switch off, and it may well be what they're being asked to learn is of no real relevance to them whatsoever. They have no agency, they have no say in the how and the what of learning. Whereas with more modern theories of learning, social development theory as an example, the students are playing a much more active role in their learning. And the teacher is facilitating the learning process rather than teaching and directing the content. So, in its simplest form, where we consider students discussing a topic in pairs or in small groups, might be they're solving a problem. They're researching climate change and what are the best ways of working with their classmates to make a positive contribution to increasing awareness around the climate crisis. The teacher isn't telling them the answer. The students are constructing that in a group with their friends. So knowledge becomes socially enabled. It's students learning from one another. Now, this is significant because it is changing the format of learning, and it is encouraging students to see themselves as being at the heart of the process. And when we've got that right, then learner autonomy is much easier to develop, that sense of learner independence. So in a traditional classroom, the teacher is at the front, they choose what to teach, they choose how to teach it. Teacher input, teacher controlled. And then at the end of the class, the teacher gives homework for the students to do, which enables the teacher to check if learning is taking place and perhaps to consolidate learning. But, and it's a big but, a number of people began to realize that this just doesn't work. And we here have a video, which is very short, 2.5 minutes, which will play for you now so that you can get an understanding of what the flipped classroom is all about and how it tried to upend the traditional classroom model.
I'm Aaron Sams, and I teach science here at Woodland Park High School. My ultimate goal, I guess, as a teacher is to help students become learners who can learn for themselves and by themselves. One of the problems that I was guilty of even prior to flipping my classroom around was the classroom was centered around me. I told them exactly what to learn, how to learn it, what assignments to do to learn it, and when to learn it, and how to prove to me that they learned it. I don't do that anymore. We changed the place in which content is delivered. Instead of standing in front of a class and delivering, here's how you do this type of problem, here's how this works, I deliver that direct instruction now asynchronously at home through these videos that we make with Camtasia Studio.
Times till whole.
Oh, we didn't do that last time.
The last step, they were already whole numbers. We had 1, 1, and 4. Here we don't have a whole number. So here's a few little tricks when you need to multiply by whole numbers. If one of your numbers ends in 0.5, you're going to multiply by 2.
Or something 0.5 times it by 2.
Right.
Okay, write this down, guys.
Yes. If something ends in 0.3 or 0.33 or 0.66, you multiply by 3.
And when the kids come to class, they don't show up to learn new stuff. They show up to apply the things that they learn at home and to ask me questions about the things they learned at home. So now they could have my lesson, if you will, what I would normally have stood up and lectured to them in class with some added features. They get that at home, and then what they were expected to do for homework is now what they do in my class. Life is different for me because I no longer am the guy who stands up in the front of the classroom and just yaks at a student for an hour or however long the class is. Now I walk around the class and I help kids. I'm a tutor, I'm a guide, I'm the putter-outer of fires, whatever it happens to be. In my crazy chemistry class, I walk around and do that. I don't stand up front and teach under the kind of the traditional model. I'm Aaron Sams. I'm a teacher, I'm a dad, I'm a husband, and I love Camtasia Studio.
So having seen the video, what do we see? We saw Aaron Sams talking a lot about how he moved his input, his teaching bit, onto video. The students watch this at home in their own time, which frees up the classroom to become much more of a laboratory, of an environment in which teachers can help students who are finding things difficult and to facilitate problem solving, task-based learning, and so on. So the classroom becomes an environment in which students are playing with what they're learning. Now, Aaron Sams, of course, has a background in mathematics and science. So you might quite reasonably be asking the question, okay, so what about language teaching? Well, the reality is there is a lot out there about the adoption of the flipped classroom to the English language teaching classroom. I've linked a talk that came out a number of years ago from Dave Spencer. Here it is, where he talks about his personal reflections of the flipped classroom. I'm not suggesting that we all need to move away from our current classroom mechanisms and all embrace the flipped classroom tomorrow. What I am suggesting is that it provides us with an idea, a vision on how things can be made more student-centered and for the classroom to become more purposeful. But it also strikes me that, in fact, even if we weren't attending to the flipped classroom before the pandemic or even now, very probably we have become more aware of making our classrooms more student-focused workshops as a result of the pandemic. So my question to you is this. Are you still asking your students to do the grunt work, as I've rephrased it? So, for example, if they are practicing their reading skills, are they doing that in the classroom, silently reading and answering questions, and then have a feedback session? Or if they're learning a grammar point, are they doing a grammar practice activity, a gap fill in the classroom? Or actually, because of what we learned in the pandemic, are you embracing the way in which we can free up the classroom as an opportunity, as a space for feedback and for discussion by saying to students, okay, do the reading at home, and then we'll talk through it in class tomorrow. Do that gap fill activity at home, we'll look at any problems that you've had in class tomorrow. In other words, removing the boring but necessary stuff, as I think most people, to be fair, would say that a gap fill is quite boring, into homework to make the classroom a more joyous, more free environment in which students can do fun things using language for communicative purposes. So with that kind of shift, because I think many of us would agree that the black and white photograph of the teacher-centered classroom is not really how most of us work anymore. But the workshop environment is much, and the student-centered environment is much more in tune with where we're at. My question is, what does AI, artificial intelligence, give us in terms of encouraging learner autonomy? Well, I think we need to address, first of all, the elephant in the room. Here are 3 questions for you. My students misuse AI and use it to cheat. True or false of you? I've shown my students how to use AI responsibly. Have you? 3, I encourage my students to use AI for independent learning. Do you? These are all important questions to consider, because I would say that the teacher who today says, oh, my students misuse AI and use it to cheat, it's your fault. Because if you haven't taught your students how to use AI constructively, then at that point, you can't really blame them. Our job as educators is to develop the skills for students to use AI well, hence the second and the third question. Perhaps a radical view, but one I believe passionately. Do agree to disagree with me in chat about this. So, in terms of the use of generative AI, and by generative AI, I'm talking about things like ChatGPT, Gemini, and so on, it has a number of real advantages. It can, when used at its best, enable a personalized, engaging, interactive content where every student in your class is perhaps learning English separately, differently in their own time. It is adaptive. It can adapt to the individual learning preferences and the progress of our students. And of course, like technology generally, it's available on demand. Students can switch it on when they want to. And because of that personalized, individualized strand, there's a great opportunity for students to go down the routes that they're interested in. Plus, of course, for organizations like the Khan Academy, there are opportunities to develop chatbots which have a particular area of interest, for example, STEM. And I don't know if you know that Gallery Teachers themselves actually is training its own ChatGPT module based around English language teaching. So one of the great things, of course, about any use of AI is the fact that we can go meta. So I thought it'd be quite useful to ask AI how it suggested that we can use AI for independent learning. My prompt was this: suggest how teenage students whose first language is not English and who have a pre-intermediate level of English can use AI to study English independently. These were the 10 responses that I got from ChatGPT. These were the responses, 5 of them, that I got from Gemini. Now, I'm not going to go through them individually in any great detail. We can look at that in more detail in the discussion afterwards. But what I think is important when we look at a screen like this, or when our students look at a screen like this, is that we read it critically rather than just taking everything that is written as truth. In other words, when we use AI, we need to develop certain skills. And I'll be fascinated to find out from all of you which of these are happening in your schools. So I think schools do need a school-wide policy for AI use. But not only a policy, schools need to work with both the students and the teachers and train them in good AI use. And in particular, as AI takes over, and it will do so more and more, in the development of AI literacy skills. You know, gone are the days, I hope, when we used to say to students, go and look it up on Google. We'll be teaching students how to use Google effectively, using Boolean operators and or not, speech marks to make their searches more effective. We also need to consider helping our students in writing decent prompts. But, and this is going deeper, and these are ideas from that article in English Language Teaching Journal, we do need to understand that there is a danger that paradoxically, by encouraging our students to use AI to become independent, they may in fact become over-dependent on AI itself. And the lack of any critical skills, so not being aware of the risks of hallucination, not being aware of the inherent bias that exists in GenAI tools, that students, if they're not trained in dealing with and being aware of these issues, may start using AI with a lack of criticality. And of course, that's before we even get to the issues around the iniquities around the access to AI, because it's not a given that every student in every school, in every home will have equal access to it. So I've tried to kind of give a helicopter view here. Yes, AI has many advantages, others which we haven't talked about today. It can be used to help a learner to set independent learning goals and a plan for learning. Tell AI what it is you want to achieve in a given period and ask AI to set you up a study period based on 2 hours of availability per night. You can feed feedback into AI and then ask it to come up with a study program which integrates feedback into your learning. So there is some kind of feedback loop. But as the red suggests, there are those dangers as well. There's the challenge of students who are able or unable to regulate their learning effectively. There is the reality that younger learners, Gen Z, although they are very happy working on their mobile phones, may actually lack deeper levels of digital literacy than students who are older than them at their age. And as we've mentioned already, there are those issues around over-reliance on tools and lack of learner criticality. Plus, of course, let's be honest, if you've ever talked to a chatbot, the chatbot is not going to replace, at least yet, human interaction and communication, because it just doesn't chat naturally. So, in conclusion, learner autonomy, yes, is truly important if students are going to go the whole way in terms of their learning, but it doesn't come naturally. Therefore, as teachers, we need to consider skills training to help learners to become better independent learners. Now, both the flipped classroom and the post-pandemic classroom introduced shifts in focus and shifts towards even greater student independence than I think was the case before, and opened up our minds to new ways of doing. So that creates a fertile ground for learner independence. Generative AI itself, ChatGPT, Gemini, I've not mentioned Claude, but an open access large language model. All of these can provide ideas for and set up answers to questions about encouraging and then implementing independent learning. But we need our learners, and I believe this passionately, to recognize the imperfections of AI. And therefore, by us as teachers spending time in the classroom to encourage students to see what it can do well, what it can do less well, and how we can embrace that, then we're going to be setting up learners for independent learning success. Here are some of the sources I've mentioned, and in particular, a really nice article from the English Language Teaching Journal. Do encourage you to read that. But this is just one of many sessions available on the TEFL platform for pro members. I'm a pro member. I really love what is available to me as a teacher trainer on here. If you're interested, there'll be information from Aris later on at the end of the session, but the link here, gtefl.com/pro-membership, that's your go-to link if you'd like to find out more. Thank you very much indeed. And now over to you for the chat.